your microphone, and if you have a question, you can raise your hand and then ask it. But or you can write on the chat session, and then you can read it, and they can answer you. So I would like to request that we can add other 5 minutes to wait for others, and then after 5 minutes we can start. Thank you. Okay, I think we can start. Thank you all for joining us. And as we were saying, the topic that we'll be discussing today is Introduction on Climate Change, and I would like to welcome our speaker who are here today, Professor Beth Kaplan from Center of Excellence on Biodiversity and Natural Resources here in Rwanda. So I would like to welcome her as we are also waiting for our other speaker, Hakuzimana Herman from Rwanda. I think I would like to ask our first speaker, Beth Kaplan. The floor is yours. You can talk to us about climate change and biodiversity as the theme of the Day of Environment this year is about time for nature. I would like to ask you to tell us about the climate change effect on nature so that we can contribute as youth. The floor is yours, Professor Beth.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me and for giving me time to talk to you. It's really a wonderful honor, and I'm really excited to tell you a little bit about biodiversity, one of the favorite things that I think one can talk about and think about, and I'm going to link it to climate change and what is happening in Rwanda based on some predictions, and I think there'll be some time for some questions and answers. So I'm going to start by sharing the screen, but the host needs to enable me to share my screen. So once that happens, then I can share my PowerPoint presentation with you. So
yes, of course.
If you can just enable the screen share for me.
Yes, we are working on it.
All right, and while we're waiting, I'm going to start out by talking to you about what is biodiversity, and I suspect many of you already know what biodiversity is, or you feel you have a concept about it, but I want to take a little bit of time to explain it to you, and I'd like you to give some thought too about what you think biodiversity is, and that will help us as we go along. So I hope you all can see my screen right now. Is that yes or no? You can see my screen?
Not yet.
Yes, you can see your screen.
Good. It seems like it's coming for some of you, and some of you have it.
Yeah, it's coming. Yes, we
Good.
can see it.
All right. If it's okay, then I'll keep going, and just let me know if there's a problem that comes up. So what is biodiversity? Well, I've got this beautiful Luesti monkey here in the picture, and this is a species that is fairly unique to montane tropical forest. It is found in Rwanda and just a couple of other countries in the world. And I want to start by thinking about what is biodiversity, and I think you all are aware of this definition that it's all the species on Earth, plants and animals and bacteria, all the species on Earth. But it's not simply a list of the species on Earth. And if some of you have ever taken a class with me, you know that I really emphasize it's not just a list of species in a place. It is also the interactions between those species. So these pictures here show, I think you all know one of the pictures with a flower, that's pollination. And pollination is one of the important interactions. We see two elements of biodiversity here. We see a bee and we see a flower, a plant. And the interaction that's happening here is part of biodiversity. It's the species, but also those interactions which come about over evolutionary time. They don't just happen when you put two species together. They have to have evolved and adapted together. So that flower attracts that bee, and that bee is attracted to that flower and carries its pollen and enables the flower to continue to survive, to pass on its genes. And the other picture shows a picture of a monkey. This is another monkey species from Rwanda, the blue monkey, and it is eating fruits. And that is also an interaction between biodiversity. It is a monkey eating a plant, the fruit in particular, and it's going to swallow those seeds and then later disperse them. And that's a very important interaction, as important as pollination, because it allows plants to spread out in their environment and regenerate. So that's another interaction. And I want to emphasize that because on the left of the screen, you can see, I think it's your left, it's my left, I hope it's the same for you, these animals behind bars. Those are animals in a zoo, and people can go visit them. And the reason I put that there is to just emphasize that biodiversity is more than simply listing the number of species in a place. Because if that were true, we could just have all the animals in a zoo. We could just keep them in cages, and we could say we've got biodiversity. We have them all kept there, safe in cages. But no, biodiversity includes those important interactions, and it is those interactions that define biodiversity. And the other slide shows, see those trees in a very nice straight line. And again, there are other species growing in there. Maybe that's all species, rows and rows of one species, pine, with other plants growing among them. And maybe you'll find some birds and some insects. But there, the idea there is that—
Excuse me, Beth.
Yes.
Can you check your chat? That there's an urgent message for you. As we are waiting for Beth again, I would like to tell you that if you have a question, you can write it on the chat session, or you can raise your hand so that you can ask it. Thank you.
I hope I can figure that out. I'm not sure. I'm supposed to try to transfer. Somehow I was accidentally made the host, which is like being the queen of the webinar. And
Yes.
I don't know how to change it. And it doesn't mean I want to stay the queen. I just am not sure. Yeah, if somebody knows how I can do that.
Okay, let's check on it.
Because I'm not really sure. Yeah, I was looking at under the section on more, and I don't see the option to change who is the host. And yeah.
If someone knows, he can help us on how we can change it.
Yeah, you must have somehow, there must have been something that you clicked that made me the host, I guess. Yeah, I don't, whoops, now I'm really getting myself very confused in here. Are you still seeing my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know. I cannot figure it out. And just so that we don't lose too much time, maybe I can keep going, and I'll just make sure if people ask to be let in. Yeah. So I'll just keep going, and I'm just here talking about the point of biodiversity is that it's more than just the species. It needs to include the interactions, and that happens over evolutionary time. So just planting a forest, for example, a forest of all one species, yes, it may attract some biodiversity, but what we really care about with biodiversity are the species and the interactions that arose over evolutionary time that we rely on for our livelihoods. And I want to show you this little table here, which lays out, this is for agricultural systems, but this can be applied to any kind of system we might think about. It could be agriculture, it could be a forest or agroforestry. But here we can see different services that we get from biodiversity. And services are the things that we get that we need and we want and we enjoy, like provisioning services. So what provisions us would be food, medicines, fibers and materials that we use to build things. Regulating services are things that regulate our environment, like pest control, erosion control, pollination, which I've mentioned. And these are services that we get from the interactions of biodiversity. So erosion control comes about from trees, for example, growing in soil, and the way that those trees interact with the soil and their root system to protect the soil from heavy rains, just as an example. And another service are supporting services, which provide support, say, to soil or nutrient cycling, so that nutrients are made available for plant growth, water cycling. And then there's also cultural services, such as places that are important to people, for prayer, for meditation, for other religious services, or also it can be sanctuary areas for pollinators or for integrated pest management. And these are just some pictures of what is threatening biodiversity right now. So just some example on the top there is an example of forest loss, which I think we're all familiar with. There's tropical forest loss, where trees are cut, and also forest patches are isolated from each other. And I also have a picture of rhino here, rhinoceros, just to show you that rhinos are extremely threatened in the world. And the reason why is because they're hunted. Probably in the history of human beings, humans could hunt rhino because there were not that many that were hunted. But today, in addition to habitat loss, to the loss of habitat that rhinos rely on, there are many more people and many more people hunting, and there's also a market for the horn of the rhino, which is used in some countries as a particular cultural or medicinal purpose. And so that has caused a massive decline in rhino. And that is considered an aspect of overhunting or overharvesting. And then that lower picture there shows where you have isolation of remaining, for example, forest patches. So we've got different forest patches just surrounded by agriculture, by human-dominated landscape. And that is also threatening biodiversity. And we usually think about biodiversity as being threatened by what's called very dramatically the evil quartet. But it's just meaning these four things that are threatening biodiversity that we know about: habitat destruction, overexploitation or overhunting, introduced species, and I think you're also familiar with the concept of invasive species. So not all introduced species may be a threat, but if they become invasive, if they spread and they outcompete indigenous species, they become a threat. And then also extinction cascades. That is where you have an interaction of several different factors. So maybe some overhunting, well, the population could still survive. But when you add habitat destruction, boom, the species is seriously threatened and on the brink of extinction. So that's what's considered a cascade. And so there are synergistic effects down at the bottom I mentioned, and also climate change, which I'm going to talk a lot more about now. And climate change is another aspect of a threat to, I'm just letting some other people in here now, to biodiversity. So let's see. I hope I've let everyone in that was in the waiting room. It's not easy being queen of the webinar. Okay, so so I want to show you just a little bit of statistics about biodiversity, the threats to biodiversity. This is from a 2014 report, so fairly recent, and it's a very sad statistic. About 52% of species on the Earth have been lost, and there's about 1 million animal and plant species that have gone extinct. And in terms of, this is native species in most land-based habitats. They have been reduced by about 20%. So just land-based simply means as opposed to being aquatic, for example, or marine. And then I also show about 40% of amphibian species are threatened with extinction, and other species, so marine species, coral species, insects have recently, in the last year or two, some reports showing they're having massive declines due to over pesticide use and loss of habitat. 680 vertebrate species have gone extinct already since the 16th century. That is more species in a shorter time than we have ever observed on Earth. And so this is a very sad statistic. And we also can remember that the biodiversity, these species and their interactions provide us with services that we rely on. And so now I want to talk about climate change. And climate change is, I think, a phenomenon that pretty much all of you have heard about. I want to make sure you understand the difference between climate change and weather. So in 1 year, we know that we have 4 different seasons in Rwanda for what we call rain and wet, rain and dry season, wet or rainy and dry season. And during, for example, the main dry season, which we are in right now, we know that there's a range of rainfall. Certainly, it's not possible that every single dry season ever is going to be exactly the same. There is going to be variability, right? I think we would all agree with that. And when we have the rainy season, there's going to be variability. Some years there's going to be a lot of rain and some years a little rain. That is weather. It varies. There's no way that somebody's up there with a big bucket measuring, I'm going to give Rwanda exactly this amount of rain every year. It doesn't work that way. And I think logically, we all know that. So that's weather. It's variable. But climate change means over a very long period of time, what we are seeing, for example, in rainfall is variability that pops outside of what we are regularly used to. So we start seeing rainy seasons that are way outside of what we've ever recorded before, or dry seasons that are outside of the normal variability that we are used to. Statistically, we need to be able to document that quantitatively to show this is outside of the normal variability. As we move along, we know it's varying, but now we're getting way outside of that. That's climate change. And climate change is going to have impacts on life as we know it. And here is a little schematic, a little diagram showing you some of the effects. Climate extremes. And that means that we are going to have rainier rainy seasons and drier dry seasons. We are going to have heavier storms and unpredictable storms, because the weather is changing in a way that is causing those normal patterns to be unpredictable. So droughts, floods, storms, people having to be displaced. Also wildfires, fires that happen because of extreme dry events, for example. And then also these storms, there's tropical cyclones in coastal areas, and very high heat that causes stress for animals and plants, including humans. And also it affects food and food security. So climate change can have a number of different impacts. And on this chart here, take a little bit of time to look on it. In this pink area here, I'm showing the different components of climate. And remember, in a short, like in an annual cycle, we can talk about temperature, rainfall, etc. But what we're talking about with climate change is how this is happening outside of what we consider to be normal variability. So temperature patterns may change, the highest, the maximum, and the minimum temperatures, or rainfall change, also CO2 concentrations, and these affect different things like ocean pH and the atmosphere chemistry. And so these are the components, these abiotic components that are going to affect biodiversity. And biodiversity can be considered in different components, from the genetics, the physiology. So I want to make this concrete for you. Physiology, you know that when it's hot, your body sweats. And sometimes it's even hard for you to function when it's so hot. And you need to have access to water when it's too hot. Those are physiological responses. And as the climate changes and temperature warms, there will be physiological changes in plants and animals. And that's going to affect where those plants and animals can live, where they can survive, how they reproduce, their behavior. And then you can go on to say the distribution, for example. It's going to affect where those animals can exist or where plants can exist. If an area, the temperature regime becomes too high, too hot, those animals or plants will no longer be able to exist there, and they are going to have to migrate or move to another area. And also ecosystem services. So if you remember, I showed you some of the services we get, regulating services like pollination, cultural services, or provisioning services. Those will all be affected by climate change. And when they are affected, that's going to affect how we are able to get those services and where we get them as well. So I want to give you a concrete example. Animals that may be living in lower latitudes, as the temperature is increasing, they may be forced to move up to higher latitudes. And this also happens along an elevational gradient from low elevation to high elevation, because we know as we're lower down, it's warmer, and as we move up, it's cooler. But as temperatures increase, animals may start moving up in elevation. And ecologists have already started documenting these shifts. So this is another important component of the impacts of climate change. I want to talk a little bit about what we think is happening in Rwanda. I have done some reviews of some of the recent research on climate change in Rwanda. And what I found are some interesting studies. There have been studies that have documented an increase in annual rainfall, ranging from 1 to 10 millimeters per year more than what was typically found. And we also have noticed there's a really recent study from 2019, and this looked at projections or modeling of climate change using predictions about how temperature would change globally. And this study showed changes in temperature, increases in temperature in the region around the Lake Victoria Basin, and also changes in rainfall, and a decrease in the average rainfall over the lake, but outside the lake. Changes here, I want to show you a map. This is the Lake Victoria Basin area, and here's where we are, over here in Rwanda. And this shows that there's going to be an increase in temperature and a change in rainfall. And this is very recent data based on modeling that was done for the region. I also found a study, this is just up through 2008, but I found this interesting because it shows an increase in temperature. So here's temperature on the y-axis, and over time, data records from 1971 to 2008 show an increase, a gradual increase in rainfall. And here, this is a really, really interesting map. The figure 2 here, I took this from that same study. It shows these, what are considered to be these climate zones in Rwanda. So I think you're all familiar with this region over here in the Eastern Province, which is dry, as we consider it to be dry, and we know it's dry. And then there's a region in the middle, a temperature zone with Central Highlands. And then there's this mountain area up by Volcanoes National Park, and down here in Nyungwe, these are high montane forests. And then along the lake is another region, a climate zone region. well, these researchers, they predicted there's going to be a shift based on climate change, that this northern region is actually going to become drier. So this is where the mountain gorillas are. Now you can imagine if this really does happen, this is going to have an impact on mountain gorilla habitat. And these are data just from one study that looked at some of the data and modeled it to look at how Rwanda may change. So the eastern province doesn't change, but it's this area here, the high mountain highland area, will change in terms of amount of rainfall. And this is just a summary of it. So southern Rwanda, especially around Nyungwe, will have increase in temperatures, and you can imagine this is going to affect plant growth, and plant growth, it will affect animals that are found in that forest. Also, as I mentioned, around the Virunga region, temperatures are going to get higher and rainfall is predicted to drop. And that's why they proposed a change in the names of those vegetation regions. And then there's another study, fairly recent, 2012, for Nyungwe National Park. And this is a schematic just showing how they did their modeling. So what went into the different aspects of the modeling. And if you're into this kind of modeling, you can contact me, I can get you the paper. But this is kind of an interesting study because what they show in these kind of crazy graphs, the thing to focus on, this is for temperature, and temperature, monthly temperature. And what they did is modeled it from 1990. They took baseline data and they modeled it through 2090, so into the future. So it's 2030, 2060, and 2090. And those orange bars are the thing to focus on. Blue is the baseline, 1990, and in the future, 2060. Temperature is increasing. That's the thing to focus on. Every month, temperature is increasing. And here also shows for precipitation. And again, you know, we talked about how we've got these seasons. So June, July, August, a drop in rainfall. But the general pattern, again, if you look at the blue, is 1990 baseline data up through 2090. There is generally an increase in precipitation for some of these months. And it's also changing the pattern of the amount of rainfall. And this is also interesting because it's shifting the typical rainy and dry season, and it's also overall increase. And again, this is probably not going to be different, not going to be same across the whole country. As the previous study showed, the more northern parts are predicted to have a reduction in rainfall, while in the south there may be more. Again, this is based on modeling, predictions of what will happen under climate change. So the summary is that temperatures are increasing regionally. That means in Rwanda and in the Great Lakes region, at about 1/3 of a degree per decade. So every 10 years, it's increasing by 1/3. And precipitation also increasing in some parts of the region. And I want to link this to biodiversity. So we are in a biodiversity hotspot. What does that mean? It means that we are in a spot that is known for extremely high biodiversity. Many species of plants and animals. Some of those species are found in this region and nowhere else in the world. Many endemic species, that's what endemism means, found here and nowhere else. It's also a very mountainous region. It has a lot of different ecosystems. It also has invasive species, and we have many threatened and endangered species in this region too. And for conservation, the main focus has been on forests, and most of the forests in Rwanda are isolated. They're like islands of forests surrounded by very heavily human-dominated landscape. So for example, when you drive from Kigali to Huye, basically everything you see is a human-dominated landscape, meaning it's agriculture, it's a working landscape. Very few indigenous species are what you can see. It's mostly introduced or exotic species of plants, pine and eucalyptus, etc. And the protected areas, while there's a very strong conservation of the protected areas, they are isolated, so they're not connected. That means that the animals cannot easily move between them, and plants cannot easily move between them in terms of pollen or seed dispersal. And this map, as you know, the map of Rwanda, I put this here just to show you, you can see the isolation. Nyungwe National Park down in the south, Gishwati Mukura National Park, here isolated from the Volcanoes National Park in the north, and then Akagera over here. And those are the 4 national parks. There are also other protected areas, wetlands and forest blocks, but they're all isolated from each other. And that is the context of the conservation that we have. Most of the wetlands in the country are outside of protected areas, and they're heavily used for agriculture and other purposes. So how will climate change interact with these ecosystems and with the biodiversity? Well, as we looked at from the data, temperature is going to increase and rainfall is going to change. So there may be drying in some regions and increase in rainfall in other regions. And we are going to have more unpredictable weather events. And we've already been seeing that here in Rwanda. So the impacts on biodiversity, this will depend on the magnitude of the temperature shifts. So how high will the temperatures go, and how adaptable are those plants and animals? And it's related to the behavior, the physiology, the ecology of those species. And we need more information about that. But I just want to refer back to this figure. These are the factors about climate that are going to affect these factors about biodiversity. So how will changes in temperature and rainfall affect physiology? Do we have enough genetic diversity in our populations to be adaptable enough to adapt to higher temperatures or less rainfall? Those are some of the things that we need to think about. And the impacts of climate change will be greatest on species that are specialized in terms of temperature, so they have a very narrow range that they can live in. Those are often species found at high elevation, species found in very adapted to, say, dry or drought frequent environments, species that live in warm climates, and also terrestrial and aquatic ectotherms, or species that rely on the outside for their body heat. And also, species at the limit of their range, so species that maybe are more found in the south, but they're in the northernmost limit of their range in Rwanda, and species with very small isolated populations. Now we have that in Rwanda. For example, the golden monkey, some of you may be familiar with, and even the mountain gorilla. They have very narrow distributions, and they're only found in a very small part of the entire world, which happens to include Rwanda. And when we start having extreme events, and you have animal, let's say plant or animal populations that are in these isolated forest fragments, they become more vulnerable because they're isolated. They don't have places to move to seek refuge. Also, with climate change, diseases can spread. And so, for example, disease vectors, insects that moving diseases can move as temperature increases, maybe gets into an area where they're more able to live and adapt. Also, frequency of fire can increase because of dryness, increased drying. And that will also affect populations of wildlife that are in those areas that have nowhere else to go. And then they'll also probably see shifts in vegetation communities. So plants that are living in these communities will probably start shifting up in elevation and shifting north in latitude as temperature increases. And probably we'll start seeing range extensions, meaning some species that are really found in a particular range based on temperature and rainfall. As that shifts, they may start shifting more north as it becomes too hot here for them, and they'll start moving more north where they get back into their temperature envelope. And I want to mention briefly some of the ways that we can study the impacts of climate change on biodiversity. We can look at phenology patterns. That means, when does flowering occur? For example, in Nyungwe forest, We can track when trees start flowering. And usually flowering is cued by environmental factor like climate or rainfall. And as climate, temperature, or rainfall start changing, we may see changes in the onset of flowering. And we can start documenting that. We can document it along an elevational gradient or a latitudinal gradient. And we can also set up experiments, and there are really interesting experiments that have been done where we have grown plants and done artificial warming or put them into more warmer areas to see if they can survive, either by moving them, say from low elevation to a high elevation, or from the west to the east, or creating an environment like with a plastic warming house where you grow them and see if they can exist in higher temperature. And those are just some of the ways that we can study the impacts of a warming climate on biodiversity. So I want to wrap this up by talking a little bit about what you can do, because I really don't want to leave this as a gloom and doom. Like, can you imagine? I wouldn't be able to stay working with biodiversity if I really believe there's nothing we can do and if we're just going to lose everything. No, I don't believe that. I believe there's a lot we can do. And, you know, the fact that you guys are hosting this webinar is a great example that you care enough and you're willing to do something. So part of this is very simple. It's just in your daily life, is how you live your life, how much resources you use, how much water you use, how much electricity you use, how much carbon emissions you give out. That's like your ecological footprint, because we all need to reduce our ecological footprint. And then another thing that you can do is sensitizing people around you. Why are bats important? Bats are important for pest reduction, pollination, seed dispersal. That's why we need them. And that's just one example. All of this biodiversity around us, we need to be sensitized to understand why it's important and how we can live with it. And that's part of our job. That's something that you can do as well. We need to have strong protected areas. Rwanda has very strong protected areas. It relies on tourism to fund those protected areas. We need to find ways to keep our protected areas resilient, especially in times like this. We're in a pandemic, COVID-19. We don't have the kind of tourism revenues coming in. How can we keep our protected areas strong? Well, we can do different things that make sure we support protected area conservation and more reliance on local tourism, for example, and on communities, supporting local communities around those protected areas. And we also need to pay attention to conservation outside the protected areas. And that relies on education, on promoting indigenous species, not just planting exotic species, not being afraid of species that we don't know enough about. And that's another big thing that you youth can do, is raise awareness about green space, about remnant forests, about the biodiversity that we can find in our backyards. And we also need science. We need you to be scientists. We need you to really rely on information and data to make decisions. And we need especially the young to become good scientists so that we know more. Do you know, in Rwanda, there's about 1 new species discovered every year. Imagine that. In this tiny country, recently there was a new species of dragonfly. There was a new species of caddisfly, a new species of moss, a new species of orchid. These are just some examples. It's mostly not Rwandans that are finding these species, and we need you to be the ones finding these species, making the government and the world aware of how important this region is, and helping to protect it, and using that information to guide policy, land use, resource management. So we really need you in that role. And I also want to emphasize participatory approaches. We can't just be scientists out there with our equipment doing our own work. We also need to engage with people living alongside this biodiversity, who are experiencing climate change, who are experiencing challenges. They're the ones that are going to be on the front lines of conservation, and we need to engage them and really work with them to understand what are the questions? What is the research that needs to be done? What information can we help you get? And how can we collaborate and work together to get that information? And also to acknowledge that communities have knowledge, they have information. It's not just about science as science in the academy, in the university, but it's also about knowledge and science coming from communities. Because they've been living in an area for a long time, they have traditions and they have knowledge that is also very important to contribute to conservation. And we also need to take into consideration gender so that the policies and the information that we have is not just focused on one group, for example, but really captures the diversity that is out there in gender and how different people experience the world and how we can make sure that that's taken into account, because we know that there are differences in how, for example, men and women interact with agriculture, with biodiversity, with keeping the home. And those are important factors as we want to develop policies that help us protect the environment and deal with climate change. And the last point I want to mention is globally strong policies. And I think that you are very, very lucky here in Rwanda, because Rwanda has really come out very strongly really on the forefront of many of these global policies and strategies. One of the first to ban plastic bags and single-use plastic, also to really embrace strong policies around reducing carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. That is huge and sends a really big message. And your task is to figure out how to implement that here on the ground. How are we going to actually implement and achieve reduced greenhouse gas emissions, for example, as we have agriculture as an important sector? So there's so much research that's needed and innovation. We really need your brains and your energy and your motivation. There's a lot of really exciting work to be done. And that's what really keeps me hopeful in this very complicated time. And I think you young people have a really big challenge, because everyone's always saying, oh, it's all up to you. You're going to do it. You know, you're our future. And I can imagine this being, oh my goodness, I have to solve everything. Yeah, it's a big responsibility and it is a big challenge. And I feel like sometimes we've left you with a mess, but we're here to try to help you. And we have information, but we need more information and we need your commitment, and you need to hold us accountable too. So I really want to leave you with, you know, a sign of hope that I think there's a lot of innovation and possibilities that can be done. And if a tiny country like Rwanda can do it, it gives me even more hope, because Rwanda has gone through a lot in its history. It's a very it has a high human population density. It's an extremely rich country in biodiversity. And again, you can be on the vanguard, on the forefront of what's going to happen in terms of how the world manages climate change and biodiversity conservation. So I want to thank you all again. I really, really appreciate that you invited me to come here today and let me talk to you. And I hope that we will be together again in the future. And I'll be happy to take a few questions. There's about 15 minutes, I think, for questions.
Thank you, Professor Beth. It was a beautiful presentation, and I hope everyone was inspired and had seen that everyone can do something to make this happen. So we have here 3 questions. Let me read them. We have a question from Gisore. And he was asking, is there a system to measure individual carbon footprint?
Yes, I wish I had bookmarked. There are some interesting websites where you can calculate your carbon footprint. And, you know, if you think about it, you can imagine what might go into it. Like, do you walk to work, or do you drive? Or do you take public transportation? And how far do you have to go? 1 kilometer, 10 kilometers? So you can easily calculate carbon emission based on that information. What kind of appliances do you use in your house? Do you cook on charcoal, or do you cook on propane, etc.? do you use solar in your house to light your lights, or how many hours a day do you have your lights on? Questions like that, and that's compiled in a little calculator automatically. You just answer a series of questions like a questionnaire, and then it will tell you your carbon footprint. And you can do that for the individual, and you can do a carbon audit for an institution. So you could do a carbon audit for, say, University of Rwanda, to find out how much is their carbon emission. And that's the starting place for figuring out how you can reduce it, because you can look at where are the areas where you have heavy carbon emission, and often there's ways for you to reduce that.
Okay, thank you. I hope he was satisfied. Maybe if he doesn't find that
I'm
kind
going
of
to look for
calculator,
that.
you can, I can help him.
Yeah.
And then we will share the website with him. And we
Yes.
had another question from David Tuvi. He was asking, it is a question on gorillas. He was saying that with climate change, will they be likely to move to higher elevations as well as move north towards the equator? Or could they move south away from the equator if there was a path for them to Gishwati, for example? That's the question of...
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question, and it's a little bit complicated because there's a lot of information we don't know. The pieces of information we do have are the predictions about climate change impacts in that region, in the Virunga Massif. So they show a reduction in rainfall and then temperatures increasing. So we don't yet know exactly how that's going to affect vegetation. So there probably will be shifts in vegetation. And we know that mountain gorillas are mainly folivores and eating vegetation. And so we don't know the shifts in that vegetation for those animals. There may be shifts up in elevation, which means probably mountain gorillas would track the shift in those vegetation if it does move up in elevation. It's doubtful that it would have to do with a shift down, say, towards Gishwati Makura. And I'm not sure about the evidence that they were in Gishwati Makura or even down to Nyungwe. There's not evidence I'm aware of that they were ever down in Nyungwe. And also those forests are not as rich in the herbaceous vegetation that the mountain gorillas feed on. So one thing that we would need to know in order to really answer that question is how the predicted shifts in changes in rainfall and temperature are going to affect the foods that the mountain gorillas feed on. That's one of the big questions that we need to answer. So there needs to be more research on that.
Okay, he asked another follow-up question. Would creating a wildlife corridor between Nyungwe, Gishwati, Mukura, and Volcanoes National Park help with species and biodiversity protection? Would such a corridor need to be a protected area or simply a low development zone?
Yeah, that's also a really great question. And I'm going to answer that in two ways. One is that it's generally not great to have protected areas that are isolated, because if something happens in a particular area, for example, in Gishwati forest, part of Gishwati Makura forest, if you have like a forest fire, could wipe out that forest. And there's golden monkeys and chimpanzees in that forest and other endemic species, and they really don't have a place to go right now, because many of them will not cross large open expanses of agricultural lands with lots of people in them. And on the other hand, in a place like Rwanda, creating these kind of corridors could be very complicated, because those areas are so dominated by humans. And if you start attracting wildlife into areas that are also heavily used by humans, you can actually increase conflict and create what are kind of like sinks or areas where mortality of those wildlife species would be higher. So you'd have to really be very, very careful about how you would do this. And I don't believe we can give one single answer right now. I again would want more information. I would want to know about the land use in that area and the willingness of people to participate in this kind of conservation, where they would either get an easement for giving up parts of their land or entering into a conservation or tourism activity in that area, for example, to allow for wildlife to be there, acknowledging that there may be conflicts. And also, I would want to know more about what will happen with the exchange of wildlife in those areas, because in addition to the conflict, you may also be combining populations that have been separated for a very long time. And we would also want to know about the genetic structure of those populations and what are the implications of bringing these populations together. So maybe that's how a lot of scientists answer the question, is we need more data. But in this case, I think this kind of information is very important, because this would be a huge step to connect these areas. And I think it really needs to be done very carefully, where we don't create a lot of conflict between people and biodiversity in those protected areas.
Thank you. As I see that we are running out of time, let me, I'm going to read only one other question, and other question maybe you will help us to answer them later, and then we can share them on our social medias for those who ask them. The last question is a question from Gilbert. Hello, I would like to ask about the extinction of animal species in Rwanda due to climate change. Are there some animal species going extinct in Rwanda due to climate change?
Yeah, great question. Right now, I'm not aware of any species that have gone extinct due to climate change. So what we are experiencing right now in Rwanda with climate change, as I showed in some of the graphs, is an increase in temperature and changes in rainfall patterns. So more rain in some areas and less rain in other areas. But so far, we have not documented any species extinctions. But I do have to say that it's why we really need to have a monitoring system in place in Rwanda to be able to monitor these populations, because currently we don't have that kind of data, like from an annual cycle of monitoring both population distribution, so where they are located, and also how many there are. And that might be of indicator species that might be more sensitive to climate change, so more sensitive to increase in temperature or more sensitive to change in precipitation. And those might be insects, there might be bird species, there might be other vertebrate species that we could choose and start to monitor. But they're not currently any animal species that I'm aware of that have gone extinct. And as far as plants may also be very sensitive to the changes in rainfall and temperature, but I'm not aware of any that have gone extinct due to climate change. It's mainly been through habitat alteration or habitat destruction.
Okay. So thank you for being with us. Thank you for your presentation. I hope everyone got inspired. Thank you for insights, and I would like to welcome our second speaker, Herman Hakuzimana from Rwanda. I don't know if he's Herman. Okay, he's not answering. We would like to welcome our second speaker, Herman Hakuzimana from Rwanda. He will talk about climate change. What is climate change? What are the causes? What are the effects? So that everyone here can get a big package on climate change and what he can do to participate in the fight.
I'm going to sign off right now. I figured out how to make you the queen host, Kurt. So, and I have to get on to another meeting this afternoon, but thank you again all so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
All right,
Thank you
bye
for your
bye.
time.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Maybe as we are waiting for our second speaker, I would like to tell you that this webinar is being recorded and then it will be shared on YouTube so that everyone can access it. Okay, in time that we are waiting for him, I would like so that everyone can write something that he learned from the presentation of Beth. The one thing that you learned that you didn't know. I'm seeing someone who wrote, I learned that data are crucial, yes. And I think that our country, we need those data so that we can see the impact really on this climate change. I think Mr. Herman is here. Hello, Mr. Herman, you are welcome. Maybe you can unmute yourself. We are not hearing you. Unmute yourself, please. Can't hear you, okay. Okay. Hello, Mr. Herman. Are you hearing me? Hello. Okay. A little bit of patience, dear participant. I think we are working on it. We can hear Herman in little time. There are suggestions. Maybe you can go to audio option and then connect your computer audio. Okay. So as we are still waiting for him, I'm still waiting for you to write something that you learned in the previous presentation. For me, I learned that, let me check my notes. I learned that in biodiversity, there is two types, genetics and physiology. And for physiology, it's when you can see the animals start moving due to increase of temperature. Is Herman in?
Hey, Karin.
Hey.
Can you?
I can hear you.
No, this is Emma. This is Emma, but
I thought
Herman
it
is.
was Herman.
Sorry.
It's
But Herman
okay.
is trying to say that is muted. So if you can check if you can unmute him.
Okay, let me check it. No, I see that Herman is, his microphone is unmuted. His microphone is on. Maybe he can speak. I think we can hear him. Here I saw that Umutesi has learned that records of climate change impacts are still scarce here in Rwanda. Yeah, I agree with you. I see here David Tuvi telling Herman that you can still use your computer audio. But if your headphone has a mic, you can use it. You are unmuted. Herman, you are unmuted. The microphone is on. Okay, as we are waiting for Herman, David Tuvi is proposing to share something. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you, Corinne. Are you able to bring up that link I sent you on your screen?
Okay, let me try. Let me share my screen.
Perfect. Thank you. I've also sent the link through to the Green Fighter host. So whoever is the host can also click and share the link.
Yeah.
Zoom.
Okay, Herman, we can hear you now.
We can hear you, Herman.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't know what happened. I was not muted, but you could not hear me.
That's the complication of technology. It's okay, it's fine.
Okay. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. I thank the first presenter because Prof. Beth Kaplan almost talked about everything, including biodiversity and climate change. And I think she made easier my task.
Yeah.
So, thank you for inviting us to this discussion. And I would like to share something on climate change based on the guiding question that you provided about you requested us to talk about climate change and global warming. I think since you've been talking about climate change and biodiversity, it will be easier. But in simpler terms, to understand climate change and the global warming requires to also to understand the composition of Earth's atmosphere, the atmosphere of the Earth. As we all know, the atmosphere is made of various gases, including nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, argon, and water vapor, and the other gases. And among those gases, there are some which have the property of absorbing and emitting radiations within, of course, thermal infrared range. And those gases that have this property of absorbing and emitting radiations are called the greenhouse gas. And they live naturally in the atmosphere, and normally they are not harmful because they act like blanket or cover of the Earth's surface in a way that they do not let all radiations from the sun reaching the Earth's surface, but also they trap some radiation from the Earth's surface. And by acting like this, they regulate the temperature of the Earth. And the research have proven that without those greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the Earth would be colder than it is. Now the average temperature of the Earth is around 15 degrees Celsius. But without those greenhouse gases that regulate the temperature, it would be about minus 18 degrees Celsius. And you understand that in these conditions, life would not be possible. But since the mid-20th century, due to the industrialization activities, there was an increasing of the concentration of those greenhouse gases due to the other emissions emitted by human activities into the atmosphere. And can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay.
Did you share a video? I mean, did you share your screen?
No, I am not using the presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, maybe I can share the notes later.
Yeah, it would be great.
Yes.
Proceed, please. Yes.
Maybe let's share the video to see to see me. I was saying that due to the concentration of those greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which started with the period of industrialization in the mid-20th century, the global or the average temperature of the Earth started increasing. This leads to what we are talking about now, the global warming, which is this process where the Earth's atmosphere is heat up due to this high concentration of those greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And in simpler terms, because we want to understand what is global warming, what is climate change, the global warming is the cause of climate change. According to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the climate change is any change of climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activities that change the composition of the global atmosphere, and which is in addition to natural variability observed over a comparable period. Meaning that normally the greenhouse gases are present in the atmosphere and they are not harmful because they help to regulate the temperature, but due to this high concentration, which started with the industrialization period when different countries were trying to develop and building the industries and building the industries, improving their transports, or due to those activities, or all those economic activities, the atmosphere received additional emissions of those gases, and it's the cause of this global warming that also at the end caused this climate change that we are talking about. And you are asking also if the climate change is real, what are the evidences? I think this is now easy because Prof. Kaplan discussed about this. There are from the various researches, now climate change is real. Of course, there are some deniers of climate change, but when you consult different researches, you will see that you will see different evidences. For example, some evidences that you can also observe from yourself, even if you discuss, let's talk about the case of Rwanda, for example. If you talk to a Nordman who was in the country, for example, in 1950s, he will tell you that the temperature has increased. According to the to the researchers, it has been noticed that the global temperature rise have risen by 0.9 degrees, which were added to the average temperature in since the 19th century. Those records on temperature rise have been showing that as we are moving, the temperature is increasing, and it is likely to keep increasing if nothing done to reverse the trend. Another evidence is about the polar ice melting. As you all know, on the polar, there are those ice sheets, and the research have shown that by the time, since 19th century, every year, those ice sheets decreases. According to the data from NASA, the ice sheets in Greenland lost an average of 286 billion tons every year since 1993. And while in Antarctica, 127 billion tons of those ice sheets are lost every year. This is a challenge, and it's an evidence that the temperature has increased because those ice sheets are melting because of the increase in the temperature. Another evidence that there is this global warming and the climate change is about the decrease of the glacier. You know, on the top of high mountains, there are those glaciers. On the top of volcanoes, on the top of high mountains, in the past, there used to be those glaciers, but due to the increase in the temperature, it has been shown that on the top of high mountains like Alps, like Himalaya, like Andes, like Alaska, and even on the top of our volcanoes like Karisimbi, those glaciers are no longer there because they melted due to the temperature which increased. Another evidence is about the sea level. it has been noticed that the sea level is rising due to this water liberated from melting of those ice sheets from the polar zones, from those glaciers. The water in the sea level has increased. And this is a challenge because, you know, many cities are built on the seas, on the ocean. And there are some island countries which are threatened by this sea level rise. Another pattern is about the change in weather patterns, like precipitation, like temperature. I said it has been noticed that there are many changes that are being observed that were not there in the past. In the past, and all those changes are attributed to this change in global warming and climate change. What is the role now of the human in this changing climate? As per the definition and as I explained, without human, we would not be saying climate change, because the human beings are responsible for this climate change. Otherwise, there would be climate variability, because this climate change is linked to this high concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, which were emitted by human being through those activities like transport, burning fossil fuel, emissions from our agricultural activities, use of fertilizers, and so on. The key human activities that can be mentioned are, as I was saying, those agricultural activities, livestock, waste, industries, transport, energy production, all those economic activities that are useful for us. They generate those emissions that are sent to the atmosphere, and in consequence, we increase this global warming. Let's take the example. The most greenhouse gases that you are talking about are carbon dioxide, or CO2. And the main source of carbon dioxide are burning of fossil fuel, like coal, like oil. The source is deforestation. When you cut the trees, there are some gases that a tree retains, which is liberated into the atmosphere. CO2 also comes from the industrial processes, especially the cement production. And as you all know, those are the economic activities that are important for countries. And to be developed, those activities must be done. Another example is on methane gas, which is also one of the greenhouse gases. The main source of methane gas is mainly from the landfill and the livestock, in manure. And as you know, the farming or farming is the activities that on which many people are relying on. The reason why the emissions from there are keep to increase. There are many activities. Those were the examples that generates those emissions that are emitted in the atmosphere to increase the concentration, which is very harmful. about the impact in the future, if nothing done to mitigate or to reduce the emissions that we are sending in the atmosphere as human beings, there might be, as Prof. Beth was saying, there might be different impacts which may start from food security, health, and biodiversity. Because if we continue, if those changes that we are observing now continues, as she was saying, some zone that are productive, for example, in agriculture, may become dry, and if they become dry, there will be a shortage of food which was produced there, and it will have the impact on food security in some regions. On human health and biodiversity, we are living. The animals and the plants live in an environment which requires some conditions, like gorillas that she was talking about. If the temperature continues to increase, it may happen that the zone which was favorable for gorillas will be no longer favorable because the temperature has increased. And this way, the gorillas or other animals may not be able to adapt to the new climate conditions caused by this increase in temperature and in other parameters like rainfall, like humidity, and so on. So the impacts in the future may be many if nothing done to reduce this high concentration which is of greenhouse gas, which is the main cause. And I am trying to be quick. Maybe we'll discuss in the questions. The extreme weather event is also another consequence that may cause other problems if nothing done. If, for example, because one of the impact of climate change is the change in those in weather patterns, like precipitation, like winds. You sometimes hear the strong winds that destroy different countries like Haiti, like US, like other countries, especially those countries which are the island or near the oceans. If those events, the frequency of these events increases, it may have the impact on human being, and some areas may not be favorable for human to be there, especially in the island and where there is the high frequency of those extreme weather events. And maybe to understand better, you can imagine if the temperature in Rwanda increases and arrives at 40 degrees. When the temperature rises, it goes with many other things, including it affects the water, it affects many other things, and the conditions, the living conditions change. This is what may lead to the dispersion of some species, like animals, like plants. And as you know, it's those plants, those animals that we rely on in our everyday life. In summary, there are many impacts that are expected if nothing done to reverse the trend in climate change. And this is why we have to act now. This leads to this question on what to do, what to be done. Because the climate change is the global challenge, it's a global issue. There are many initiatives that have been done. Starting in 1992, countries negotiated this convention of United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to try to limit the impact of climate change. And further, Kyoto Protocol also came in 1997, and Kyoto Protocol was about to ask countries to reduce their emissions up to the level which is not harmful to atmosphere. And according to Kyoto Protocol, countries like developing countries, countries were grouped in groups, and developing countries, which played an important role in this climate change that we are talking about, were asked to reduce their emissions up to the level that they had in the 1990s, to be sure that we stabilize this greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And recently in 2015, also at a global level, you heard about the Paris Agreement. It was negotiated, and we are party to, as Rwanda is also party to the agreement. And the Paris Agreement also was the main objective of Paris Agreement was to hold this increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius, because there are many researches, including the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, which shows that by 2100, we have the global average temperature will have increased by 2 degrees, and the impact will be very, very harmful. And the Paris Agreement came in then to try to limit this global increase in the temperature well below 2 degrees, to limit all those consequences. Yes. At country levels also, there are many initiatives that have been done. Paris Agreement has asked, has used the countries to show what they intend to do to limit this global warming in the form of the reports that are submitted to the Secretariat of the Convention. The report known as National Determined Contributions, which contain the measures in adaptation to climate change, but also in mitigation to climate change. And Rwanda also as party to the Paris Agreement and to the UNFCCC. We've taken also different measures because not only to report to the convention, but also because the government of Rwanda takes climate change as a challenge also to development, to economic development. Among those measures, maybe I will share with you some reports, some documents that you may go through to understand better the measures taken by the government of Rwanda to combat and to adapt to climate change. Yes, and the role of Rwanda as least developing countries to combat climate change. As I was saying, we ratified all those conventions to join effort with the global community to combat climate change, but also we at country level we set different measures in different sectors to combat climate change. As since 2011, Rwanda adopted the Green Growth and Climate Resilience Strategy to guide the country to guide the country to adapt and to mitigate climate change. This strategy has the vision of that the country, but that by 2050, the country will be a developed, a climate resilient, a developed country, which is climate resilient, and also the strategy requires all sectors to set the measures to put the measures in their strategic plan that are aiming to adapt and to mitigate climate change. As we are running behind the time, let's also come back on what we can do at individual level. At individual level, as the youth, which wants to play the role in this fight to climate change, there are good practices that we can adopt. Kaplan mentioned about how we use the resources. It's good that we organize this webinar to discuss, but let's see our behaviors and see what we can do to maybe to help to join the efforts to combat climate change. Like for example, in our everyday life, we used to take buses, take cars. If we could develop for example, as an easy thing, if we could develop the habit of using a motorbicycle or using our foot where possible, this would reduce the emissions that comes from the transport. In our home, there are some people who have the habit of burning the waste. As a youth who knows the consequences, we should take the lead and sensitize the people that burning, any form of burning, is not allowed because it increases those emissions into the atmosphere, and so on. I don't want to take too much of time. Maybe we can keep discussing through the questions. Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. Herman. Thank you for your presentation, and I hope that everyone learned more on climate change and can see what we can do together. So we have many questions, but I'm going only to give two questions because we are running out of time, and then others I can see that it is more on they are more direct on the action of the country. Maybe I can invite you tomorrow, because tomorrow we will be discussing more on Rwanda action. So
Yes.
let me share you with the two questions. Okay. The There's someone called Ucheye. She asked, my name is Ucheye. I'm 15 years old, young girl from Rwanda. My question is, what is the link between climate change and global economy, especially for our country, Rwanda? That is the question from Ucheye. Maybe if it is possible,
I lost you. Can you repeat the question, please?
Okay. She's asking, what is the link between climate change and global economy, especially for our country, Rwanda?
The link between climate change and the global economy. There's a link. There is a link between climate change and the global economy because climate change may affect positively or negatively the economy, as the economy also affects climate change. Let me explain. As I have been explaining, climate change we are talking about climate change now because the economic activities caused the high concentration of those greenhouse gases, which caused the global warming and the climate change. Without those activities, we should not be talking about climate change, but because it will not be there. In this sense, the global economy influence negatively climate change, but also at return, when the climate change, after this changes in the climate, there is an impact on the global economy too, in a sense that if we are experiencing, like, for example, those heavy rains, they destroy what we have done, and they hamper the development. They hamper the economy. If we had built the roads, the houses, different buildings, and due to the heavy rains, due to the floods and the landslide, they are washed. We are not progressing. In this sense, climate change affects negatively the global economy. We will keep repairing what was destroyed by those climate effects if we do not take adequate measures to mitigate it. Again, but the economy also can influence positively climate change. To combat or to mitigate climate change, people are requested to shift from the business as usual and use technology, for example, in energy, to avoid to use renewable energies. And when there is economy, research also is developed, and the new technologies which are friendly to climate change can be also be developed. In this sense, the economy can influence positively on climate change. In summary, there is a linkage between climate change and the global and the economy, as one can influence negatively or positively the other. Thank you.
Thank you. And the second question is from Bakundukize. He's asking, which are the measures of early warning system which are in place in Rwanda, as climate change is a root cause of many effects related to hazards, loss of lives in our country?
Okay, it's a very good question. Yeah, there are different measures for early warning that were put in place. I think he sometimes, or he, you watch TV, even during every day you see those messages that are broadcasted by Meteo Rwanda to say how the weather will be tomorrow or in this season. All those messages are aiming to give this early warning. But there are different levels. There are messages dedicated to agriculture. There are messages dedicated to different categories. And Midima also, Minema, in partnership with Meteo Rwanda, they have the system of communicating, providing them communicating the message to the Rwandans, especially those regions which are vulnerable to heavy rains, to know how they can, what they can do. Even if need be, they can also leave their houses if there is they expect there is heavy rains or the unusual event that is expected. As you may have heard also, there is the system of monitoring our rivers to know their levels. Of course, the early warning is still being developed, but there are some measures of, that were put in place and to help countries and the population to get the information at least before, to know what to do and to save their lives from those hazards. But here I would like to emphasize that no one masters, even though there are those forecasts, even though there are those early warning messages, things may happen because the atmosphere is global and it changes very quickly. But there are measures to keep increasing these early warning systems.
Okay. Thank you for your answers. I've seen someone who was asking where we can find the documents contain mitigations, but I think after this presentation and this webinar, they will be shared to everyone who would request them. And
also,
for people,
but also I would like to invite you. We have online climate portal.
okay.
I can share the link where you can always see those documents. But also, if you go on the on the REMA website, you can find some useful documents. On the website of the Ministry of Environment, you can find different documents. Yeah, they are all available.
Great. Then you can share with us that link. It can be great. And I would like to tell people who had also different questions about Rwanda action. I would like to invite you tomorrow. We'll go deep on Rwanda action on climate change. And I would like to thank you so much, Mr. Herman, for sharing with us your insight on climate change and your knowledge. I think each one of us has learned something new today. And with this, I thank you everyone who participated. It was really great to have you. Please come tomorrow. We'll talk more on Rwanda side. We will see what we can do. We'll see what are the steps in which Rwanda is doing. And before ending, I would like to ask David Tuvi. He wanted to share us something. Maybe he can share us before we end. So I would like to thank you everyone who joined. This is your time, David Tuvi.
Thank you so much for that quick quick time. Thank you, Herman, for your great intervention, and for all young people who are looking for more information. Herman is a great resource and always available. So please do contact him and the REMA team. So I had just shared a link with the team, with the Greenfighter team, just to follow up on, just while we're waiting for Herman, but they've kindly offered for me to talk through it. So I think you remember that it was Biodiversity Day on the 22nd of May, just a few weeks ago. And so as part of that, I put together some of my favorite nature-based solutions in Rwanda. And in terms of some of the things that Beth and Herman were talking about, there are a lot of ways that nature can help us to respond to climate change. So often we talk about, electric vehicles, or about stopping burning like charcoal or diesel, or we talk about like these technology solutions. But actually a lot of the solutions that we can use to address climate change are already with us in nature, and from a policy perspective are actually quite cost effective. So maybe if Ineza, who's managing the screen, can just scroll down to the first, maybe you can just click on the tweet and it will expand and show the thread. So if we just scroll down now. Great. So one of those solutions is wetlands, as Beth mentioned, and wetlands have a really important role to, in terms of addressing and helping us respond to climate change in Rwanda. And I won't go into too much detail, but you can see some of them there. And the key thing is that wetlands will help Rwanda to manage the increased rainfall that comes as a result of climate change. So if we don't manage wetlands well, then we're going to see more flooding. But if our wetlands are healthy, if they have lots of plant life, lots of animal life, then they will help us to manage those floods correctly. And there are a few other ways that wetlands also support to deal with climate change. If we scroll down. So trees and forests also play a really important role. So maybe you know, maybe you haven't heard before, but Nyungwe National Park actually provides 70% of Rwanda's fresh water. I know that's kind of a crazy figure, but to think that 70% of Rwanda's fresh water comes from the rain that falls over Nyungwe is just incredible. But trees also purify the air, they store carbon dioxide, and they also enable us to earn money from ecotourism, which is really, really important. And there was a study that was done by WCS, the Wildlife Conservation Society, and they found that the annual value of Nyungwe National Park to Rwanda's economy was $4 billion. The annual value of Rwanda, of the park, and its ecosystem services to the economy was $4 billion, which is incredible. Let's scroll down to the next one. As it loads, that's okay. It should. Okay, great. The final one I'm going to talk about. There's two I'm going to talk about. One is elephants. Okay. Now we might not think that elephants have anything to do with climate change, but actually elephants play a really important role in maintaining specific habitats. And by maintaining those habitats, they can also help other species. And one of those habitats is savannas. So elephants actually help to promote like grassland growth in savanna areas, and that helps other animals to thrive there. Now the final one I'm going to discuss, and I'll share this link to this thread in the chat, but the final one I'm going to talk about, just as Beth mentioned it, is bats. And this is something that I want all of you to think about when you go back into your communities and talk to your friends, because bats have obviously had a lot of bad press lately with COVID-19, with the fear that bats have spread the virus, potentially through another animal, but likely through bats. So just make sure that, when you're talking to your local, your communities or your family or friends, and if bats come up and people say we should get rid of all of the bats, just know that actually bats have a huge role to play in terms of controlling pests. So if there's anybody who is a farmer, if there's anybody who has ever been affected by malaria, know that bats are your friends. Bats can eat more than 70% of their weight in insects, and that includes mosquitoes. And they also pollinate flowers and spread seeds, which helps us to grow crops. So even though bats might look a little bit scary and a little bit gross, and we might not want to get near them, which we shouldn't, they do play an important role in our ecosystem. And the more that we have animals like bats and bees and birds pollinating our plants, our trees, our flowers, the more able we are to encourage new growth of nature, which also helps to address climate change by reducing the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So this is just a quick way that nature can help us to solve climate change. I'll send the link to this on the chat so you can go through and keep learning. But always remember that we absolutely need to use the technological solutions that we come up with, but we also need to look at nature-based solutions. Thank you. Karine, are you there?
Okay, thank you. So I thought that you were hearing me. Sorry. Thank you, David, for your information. We can see that nature play a big role in sustaining our lives on this earth. Thank you so much. Okay, let me end this with quoting one of the remarks of the Minister of Environment on the day of Environmental Day. She said that we can't survive without nature, but nature can survive without us. So thank you, everyone. See you tomorrow. Thank you for participating. And thank you for everyone who spoke today. Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.